I never imagined my own daughter's wedding day would begin with humiliation so sharp it would feel like a blade twisting inside my chest. Parents spend a lifetime picturing this day, the music, the laughter, the first glimpse of a child in their gown, the moment of walking them down the aisle. For years, I'd pictured Emily as a bride, and I always assumed I would stand tall beside her, proud and steady, the way a father is meant to be. Instead, I stood frozen on the polished marble steps of the Ritz-Carlton San Francisco, staring at my own face printed larger than life on a poster. It was a clean, professional photo of me, the kind taken at a company Christmas party years ago when I still worked in real estate. Someone had blown it up, framed it, and mounted it on an easel right beside the hotel's glass entrance doors. And beneath my smiling face, in sweeping black script, were 3 words that crushed whatever was left of my dignity. Entry forbidden, by request of the bride and groom. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of mistake, a prank maybe, or an inside joke I didn't understand. But then I saw the way guests slowed as they approached the doors, eyes flicking from the poster, to me recognition sparking in their expressions before they hurried inside whispering behind carefully raised hands. They knew. Everyone knew. The father of the bride had been banned from his own daughter's wedding. My fingers trembled around the small velvet box I carried. Inside was a necklace I'd spent weeks choosing a gift for Emily to wear on her honeymoon. It was the kind of gift a father gives when words fail, when pride and love overflow into something tangible. And now, in the space of a few seconds, the gift felt meaningless, as useless as the man holding it. A uniformed security guard stepped forward. He was polite, professional, but there was no mistaking the firmness in his posture. "Sir," he said quietly, "you're not expected here." My throat tightened. "This is my daughter's wedding." The words came out cracked small, like they belonged to a much older man. He shifted uneasily, his hand resting on my elbow, guiding me back from the door. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Miller, but the couple was specific about this arrangement." Behind the glass, I could see the glitter of chandeliers, the swell of flowers tables dressed in ivory linens. Everything looked like a dream, the kind of celebration people spent years saving for. My $60,000 were probably in there, woven into every bouquet and champagne flute. A fortune spent to create beauty I wasn't even allowed to witness. I felt the sting of eyes on me from every direction. Emily's college friends, my brother from Boston, even neighbors who'd once sat in our Brooklyn kitchen eating birthday cake. They filed past pretending not to stare, pretending not to pity me. And yet pity was written across every face. They could see the resemblance between the man in the photograph and the man standing discarded on the steps. They could see the rejection carved into me. Something inside me cracked, then not loud, not violent, but a clean, quiet break, the kind that doesn't heal. I bent down, placed the Cartier box gently on the ground beneath my own picture, and straightened my tie. My hands no longer shook. My chest still ached, but the raw pain had begun to cool into something steadier, colder. Humiliation had burned away the last of my illusions. This wasn't just about Emily's choice anymore. This was about Brandon, the man she insisted on marrying. He had orchestrated this spectacle, this public crucifixion of a father, to ensure no one could miss the message I was no longer welcome in my daughter's life. I gave the guard a nod. "Would you mind calling me a taxi?" Relief flickered across his features. Perhaps he'd expected to see tears or shouting, but I was too hollow for theatrics. I simply turned my back on the entrance, my back on the music beginning to drift through the open doors, and walked toward the curb. The city bustled around me, oblivious. Couples strolled arm in arm, taxis honked, cable cars clattered down Powell Street. Life went on while mine was being quietly erased from the most important chapter of my daughter's story. As the cab pulled up, I took one last glance at the poster. My own eyes stared back, frozen in that professional smile, a man who had believed in family, in loyalty, in trust. That man had been a fool. He didn't yet know the betrayal waiting for him. He didn't know that the man standing beside his daughter in tuxedoed perfection was nothing but a predator, wearing charm like a mask. Sliding into the cab, I gave the driver the address of a Chase Bank branch downtown. My voice was steady, now calmer than I expected. The driver nodded, pulled away from the curb, and I watched the Ritz shrink in the rear window, a palace of light and music fading into the distance. I thought of Margaret, then my late wife. She'd always been sharper than me, always seen through the smooth talkers, the too good to be true promises. She would have spotted Brandon's type from the first handshake. I should have listened to her voice in my head months ago when Emily first announced her engagement. But I hadn't. I'd wanted to believe in my daughter's happiness, wanted so badly to see her smile that I'd silenced every alarm bell. Now I was paying the price not just with money, but with blood in the form of humiliation. The cab wound through the hills past boutiques and gleaming office towers while I stared out at a city I barely knew. San Francisco was supposed to be a place of celebration for me, a backdrop to one of life's proudest milestones. Instead, it had become the stage for my public exile. By the time we reached the bank, the sun was beginning to dip, throwing long shadows across the granite facade. I stepped out, adjusted my jacket, and walked inside with deliberate calm. I had already lost my daughter's trust, perhaps permanently, but there was still one thing I could reclaim: my money, my dignity, my ability to protect myself, even if I could no longer protect her. That was the moment the father who had walked up those Ritz-Carlton steps died, and the man who stepped into Chase Bank was someone else entirely colder, sharper, stripped of illusions. I didn't yet know the full storm that was coming. I didn't know about the 73 missed calls that would light up my phone later that night. I didn't know how far Brandon's carefully built facade would crumble when pressure mounted. But as I stood at that teller's desk and asked to cancel a check, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I wasn't finished. January in Brooklyn narrows a life to lamplight steam hissing in the pipes and small rituals that keep a man steady. I kept mine leather chair by the window newspaper folded into obedient rectangles, coffee cooling faster than memory, the clock in the kitchen marking time with an indifferent pulse. The evening was ordinary in the ways I trusted. I cooked, cleaned, sorted a pile of mail, nudged the thermostat, checked the latch. Outside, wind worried the streetlights. Inside, the room held. I believed this calm belonged to me. Then my phone lit the table like lightning in a museum. The quiet ended with a slab of blue light. Emily's face filled the screen. Grown woman and little girl, at once angles sharper, the same quick dimple when joy slammed through. Her words tumbled over each other. That breathless rhythm returned the one she had, after sprinting home with perfect grades. She told me she had news, and the room seemed to tilt. She was engaged, and a name followed, like a door blown open by weather Brandon Hughes. She lifted her hand, and the ring scattered light across her cheek, comet skittering toward a smile I wanted to believe. Behind her, the apartment announced itself without sound. A wall of glass framed the skyline San Francisco, stacked like a jewelry box. Marble countertops reflected the city back at itself. A balcony railing gleamed. The kitchen looked staged, a catalog's dream of life. No crumbs, no stains, no history. Emily's voice carried a new certainty. He had surprised her with the proposal and this place. Everything felt aligned, she said, as if the world had finally clicked. I watched the reflection in the glass more than her face and felt the machinery of worry begin. It looked expensive and temporary. I tried to meet her happiness without sounding like an adjuster taking notes. I asked where he was from, what he did, how they met. Her answers were polished like stones rolled by water. He invested in cryptocurrency and stage tech, advised founders, and spoke on panels about risk and vision. He diversified. He said spread exposure hedged the downside, trusted macro cycles when others flinched. He moved between the city and the peninsula depending on where money slept. He knew people who knew people. He believed in the future, and he spoke of it if it owed him obedience. He stepped into the frame like a man hitting his mark. White shirt open at the throat, navy jacket shaped to his shoulders, hair that made a case for precision. His face had the handsomeness cameras prefer. Nothing out of place. He offered me a respectful greeting, the softened deference men use around fathers, humble without surrender. He called Emily his home, and his horizon words that glowed without warmth. What bothered me was not his language, but his attention. His eyes skimmed, slipping left toward something unseen. His wrist angled, the watch flashed. Thumb on Emily's shoulder traced ownership. They told me the date as casually as people pick a restaurant. March 15th, 8 weeks away. A cancellation had opened the Ritz-Carlton on Nob Hill. The quartet could be rearranged. The florist could scale up. He was handling vendors, negotiating packages, coordinating tastings, smoothing logistics I was welcome to admire. When you know, Emily said, and I understood the engine. Speed posed as certainty, momentum posed as fate. I felt the brake under my foot, then lifted it. I told her I was happy she needed happiness, and I could not bear to thunder in her light. After the screen went dark, the apartment resumed its posture, but something sat crooked like a frame knocked off level. I placed the phone face down and listened to the radiator argue with winter. The chair took me in familiar as habit, and still I hovered a father rehearsing reassurances he did not trust. My daughter had chosen a man I did not understand. That was the sentence in the night. Fathers are granted unease. Daughters may ignore it. Between those permissions, life instructs. I decided to still myself, watch details, and let evidence do the talking Margaret would have demanded. I stood before the shelf where Margaret's books live a city of spines. She left pencil breaths in the margins, underlines that felt like a hand on my shoulder. She believed in pressing on shiny stories until they rang true or cracked. I tried to imagine what she would have asked. She would have wanted receipts, timelines, names, the paperwork that makes claims stand or fall. She had a way of tilting her head when a balance sheet lied. I missed the crease between her brows more than the certainty it delivered. Grief returned as instruction asked questions, then wait. Sleep would not come, so I walked the perimeter of apartment and took attendance of proofs. The framed photo from Emily's graduation smiled with confidence. The cracked ceramic bowl she made in 5th grade held my keys. My suit jacket, stiff with victories, hung on the closet door like an argument. Fathers keep artifacts in self-defense. We arranged them to remember our hands steadied the structure. I made a list of mercies and a list of doubts, then watched them trade places. Perhaps speed is not a verdict. Perhaps Polish is not a mask. Perhaps I feared being moved aside. Near midnight, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a message I did not send. I told Emily I loved her, that I would show up standing straight even if my voice wavered. I said I wanted to meet him in person, to shake a hand without a screen turning us into performers. I promised not to cross-examine, only to pay attention. I typed the date, March 15th, hoping letters might slow time. Then I deleted the draft and let Box breathe. In the quiet, a truth named itself. I would meet this man, and I would remember everything. The snow along Lexington Avenue had melted into gray ridges pushed to the curb, where taxi tires spat it back into the air as filthy spray. Manhattan in February had a way of feeling like it had been carved from cold steel, but I pulled my scarf tighter and told myself the weather didn't matter. What mattered was the man waiting for me at a table inside a restaurant I couldn't have afforded 10 years earlier. The maitre d' didn't need me to say his name. Mr. Hughes is already here, he said with a small tilt of his chin, leading me toward a corner booth. The restaurant smelled of citrus and butter. Waiters moved like trained dancers, and every surface gleamed as if wealth itself was being polished each morning before service. I reminded myself I was here to listen, not to be impressed. Brandon Hughes stood to greet me. The handshake was firm but damp, a contradiction that lingered in my palm longer than I liked. He wore a navy suit pressed so sharply it seemed like it would cut his skin if he moved too quickly. His smile held the weight of practice, the exact angle perfected in bathroom mirrors and headshots. He waved toward the chair across from him, his movements slow, deliberate, the way a man behaves when he wants the world to notice his composure. We ordered coffee. He didn't touch his cup. Instead, he rotated it exactly a quarter turn every few minutes, as though symmetry might hold him together. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the intimacy of confession, the hush of conspiracies. "Mr. Miller," he said, leaning forward, "I want you to know how much Emily means to me. She is my future. I would never let anything harm her happiness." I nodded, waiting. He paused, drew a slow breath, then lowered his gaze as though embarrassed to continue. "But I'm facing a temporary complication." The phrasing sounded rehearsed, like a speech he had recited in the mirror until the inflection felt authentic. He explained that his assets, his cryptocurrency funds, his venture stakes, were tied up in a regulatory review. "Nothing serious," he assured me. "It will all clear in 6 months." He said it with a shrug, the way men do when they want a problem to sound trivial. But then he leaned closer. "The issue is the wedding. The Ritz-Carlton requires full payment up front. The caterers, the florists, the band, all the vendors expect deposits now." I sat very still, fingers interlaced on the table, watching him fidget with his cup. "How much are we talking about?" $60,000 would cover everything, he answered, almost too quickly. Then, as if aware of his haste, he pulled a folder from his leather briefcase. Inside were documents stamped and signed, spreadsheets dense with numbers charts climbing upward. Portfolio statements worth millions, 2.5, if I believed the figures. "This is just a liquidity issue," he said. "By year's end, I'll return every cent with interest if you like." The folder slid across the table like a magician's flourish. I looked down at seals and signatures, not knowing how to test them, only noting how easily they appeared, as if they had been waiting for this very performance. Something in my chest warned me a pulse of Margaret's voice carried from years past. She never trusted men who performed humility while clutching control. She'd say, "Look at his eyes, David. Where do they go when he speaks?" And I did look. His gaze never settled on mine. It darted over my shoulder, toward the waiter, toward the wall clock, toward his own reflection in the window. His thumb stroked the edge of the folder, a rhythm betraying nerves. But then I thought of Emily, of the joy in her face when she held up that ring, of how desperately she wanted this fairy tale. Father is supposed to protect, yes, but also to support, to sacrifice. I had retirement savings investments tucked away like lifeboats. 60,000 wouldn't sink me, but the thought of denying her the day she dreamed of that might drown me in regret. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I wrote the check. Each stroke of ink dragged across me like wire pulled tight. Brandon's eyes followed the pen with hunger, his body leaning forward as though he feared I might stop mid-signature. When I finally tore the check from the book, he snatched it too quickly, tucking it into his wallet with almost reverent care. "You won't regret this," he said, his voice breaking into a smile so wide it no longer looked natural. He stood, abruptly straightened his tie, and announced he had urgent calls with vendors. And then he was gone, leaving behind half-finished coffee and the faint scent of cologne too strong for daylight. I remained at the table long after staring at my own hand, now empty, and at the folder he had shown me, which he had conveniently packed away. Around me, other patrons talked of market swings and ski trips, their laughter rising over the hum of polished wealth. I felt like an intruder in their world, a man who had just handed over more money than some people made in a year, and done so against his better judgment. The walk back to my hotel blurred. Lights smeared across wet pavement horns, barked taxis surged, but all I felt was the weight in my chest. I told myself I had done it for Emily, that the check was a bridge to her happiness, not a noose for my doubts. But deep inside, beneath every layer of justification, something cold pressed harder and whispered, "You've just been played." That night, I opened Margaret's old journal, the one she had given me years ago, with pages mostly blank. I wrote in slow, deliberate script, February 2nd, 2025, gave Brandon Hughes $60,000 for wedding expenses. Emily doesn't know. Something feels wrong, but I made a promise. The pen left grooves in the paper as though my doubt wanted to carve itself permanent. When I closed the book, the apartment felt heavier, like walls leaning inward. I sat in darkness, listening to the radiator breathe, and I wondered if my late wife was somewhere shaking her head at me. Back in Brooklyn, February nights have their own silence, a kind that presses against the window panes and drifts through every room like dust. After that meeting with Brandon, I couldn't slip back into the rhythm of ordinary life. My body went through the motions, coffee in the morning, groceries at the corner store, newspaper folded by the chair, but my mind circled one question: what had I just done? $60,000 had left my account. The ink on the check still wet when Brandon slipped it into his wallet. The first days after I tried to treat it like an act of faith, a father's gesture, an investment not in a wedding, but in his daughter's happiness. I told myself that parents give children build, and trust must be the currency that ties one generation to the next. But when I sat down to read, the words dissolved into patterns that made no sense. The television flickered, conversations unfolded, but every sentence seemed to bend back toward the same thought: I don't know this man. At night, sleep splintered into shallow fragments. I woke to shadows shaped like figures at the foot of the bed. Margaret's photograph on the nightstand glowed faintly in the lamplight, her smile froze in her eyes, carrying questions she wasn't alive to ask. She had always been the skeptic, the one who asked for receipts, contracts, references. I'd been the optimist, willing to trust handshakes, charmed by smooth voices. In marriage, we balanced each other. Alone, I tipped toward gullibility. On the fifth restless night, I gave in. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, where bills and unopened envelopes had begun to pile. The screen's glow turned the room into a different place. Clinical, expectant. My fingers hovered before I typed his name, Brandon Hughes, San Francisco. At first, the results were immaculate. LinkedIn profiles boasting polished career arcs, articles quoting him at conferences about blockchain innovation, blog posts that seemed crafted to showcase intelligence. It looked too tidy, every detail carefully arranged like a storefront display. There were no rough edges, no embarrassing college photos, no chatter from friends. His online presence wasn't lived in. It was manufactured. I pressed deeper, adding lawsuit, then fraud, then Los Angeles. That's when the shine cracked. Court filings appeared numbers and names hidden in dense legal language. A woman named Melissa James had filed a civil complaint 2 years earlier, alleging misrepresentation and financial loss after investing in one of his ventures. Another case buried on page 4 of search results named him as a defendant in a dispute over identity theft. The dates overlapped suspiciously with the years he claimed to be launching new funds. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I clicked through PDF after PDF, each one heavy with accusations, each one resolved with vague settlements or cases dismissed on technicalities. Nothing that screamed guilt outright, but enough smoke to suggest a fire. I printed what I could. The hum of the printer filled the quiet kitchen, each sheet sliding out like a warning. I stacked them into manila folders, labeling them with dates and names. When I stopped, it was dawn. The sky over Brooklyn was a smear of gray, and the radiator knocked like it too was awake with worry. I looked at the stack on the table and felt as though I'd built a barricade, a paper fortress, against the charm of a man I couldn't trust. Still, doubts can be slippery things. Part of me wondered if I was being paranoid, if grief over Margaret had sharpened suspicion into obsession. Maybe every entrepreneur had lawsuits, especially in volatile industries. Maybe I was seeing patterns where only coincidence existed, but I couldn't forget the way his eyes shifted during our meeting, how his thumb tapped against the folder like a man rehearsing nervousness rather than feeling it. The following evening, I called Emily under the guise of casual conversation. She sounded blissful, buried in wedding details, her voice fluttering with excitement. She talked about flowers and music, about the dress fittings and the view from the hotel ballroom. Every word was an arrow between my ribs, because in her story, Brandon was not a suspect. He was the architect of joy, the man orchestrating her dream. My silence on the other end must have seemed strange because she paused. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked. I forced a smile into my voice. "Just tired," I lied. After we hung up, I sat in the dark. The folder of evidence lay inches from me, whispering to be opened again. But I couldn't. That night, I poured a drink instead, something Margaret would have scolded me for. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, but it gave no comfort. The following week, the mailman delivered another reminder of the choice I'd made. My bank statement, crisp and indifferent, displayed the outgoing check in black and white. Check number 31,60,000 Pay Brandon Hughes. My name signed beneath a verdict written in my own hand. I thought of my neighbors, the men I chatted with at the hardware store, the retired teachers who still jogged in Prospect Park. What would they say if they knew I had handed $60,000 to a man I barely knew? They'd call it foolish reckless. And maybe they'd be right. But how could I explain that sometimes love demands foolishness, that fathers will walk willingly into traps if it means keeping their children's smiles intact? Still, the doubts would not leave. They followed me into every corner of my days. When I shopped for groceries, I found myself calculating how many bags of food $60,000 could buy. When I walked past the brownstone where Emily grew up, I thought of how long it had taken me and Margaret to save that much dollar by dollar, year by year. And now it was gone, folded into a stranger's wallet, transformed into promises I wasn't sure would be kept. By the end of the second week, I had filled 2 folders with evidence printouts of court filings, screenshots of online articles, notes scribbled in the margins. It was a map of suspicion, a landscape of half-truths and shadows. I didn't yet know how to use it, but I clung to it as the only weapon I had. That night, I wrote again in Margaret's journal. February 14th, 2025. Still uneasy. Emily is happy, but I fear she doesn't see what I see. I can't shake the feeling that Brandon is hiding something. I pray I'm wrong. The pen hovered after that last line. For once, I wished Margaret could scold me. Tell me I was overreacting, remind me to trust. But the apartment stayed silent, and the only voice was my own. I closed the book, returned it to the drawer, and stared out at the Brooklyn skyline. Somewhere across the country in San Francisco, my daughter was laughing with a man I suspected was lying about everything, and I was powerless to stop it. Valentine's Day dawned with brittle light through the blinds, a morning that should have carried simple reminders of love, of memory of Margaret. Instead, it carried weight. My folders of evidence had grown thick, spilling across the kitchen table like the aftermath of a storm no one else could see. I hadn't planned on making the call that morning, but after staring at my coffee until it went cold, after rereading the court filings and testimonies until the words blurred, I knew I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Emily had to know. My fingers hovered over the phone. I told myself to wait to gather more proof, to hire someone professional who could verify everything. But fathers don't work like that. When you believe your child is walking into danger, you don't ask permission to act. You step in even if it costs you the very relationship you're trying to save. When Emily answered, her voice was bright, almost humming with joy. She had been out shopping for flowers, she said, and Brandon had everything else under control. Her words came quickly, each one polished with happiness. I listened, and each syllable was a blade twisting deeper, because behind the veil of her happiness was the shadow of a man who had already tricked me out of $60,000 and likely far more from others before her. I waited for her voice to slow, then I spoke. "Emily," I said, keeping my tone steady, "I need to tell you something important." She laughed lightly, distracted as though juggling bags and keys. "Dad, you sound so serious. What's wrong?" I took a breath. "Brandon asked me for money." The silence on the line sharpened instantly. "That's not true," she said, her voice cutting. "He told me his assets were frozen. He needed $60,000 for the venue, the flowers, the band. I wrote him a check. I promised not to tell you, but I can't keep this from you." Her breathing changed, quickened, each inhale jagged. "You're lying. Brandon would never do that. He shows me his accounts, Dad. He has millions. Why would he need your money?" I pressed my thumb into the edge of the table until it hurt, grounding myself. "Because he's not who he says he is. I have documents, Emily, court cases in Los Angeles, women who say he stole from them. The same story over and over." Her voice cracked then, but not with gratitude, only rage. "You can't stand that I've grown up, can you? You can't let me be happy. You've always been controlling, always suspicious. You don't want me to marry him because you can't bear to let me go." My chest tightened. I wanted to protest, to remind her of every sacrifice, every bedtime story, every scraped knee I had bandaged. But I knew none of that mattered now. To her, in this moment, I was no longer a father trying to protect. I was the enemy threatening the future she wanted to believe in. Before I could gather another thought, another voice cut into the call. Smooth, practiced calm. "Brandon, Mr. Miller, I understand your concerns. These accusations, they're old. They've been dismissed. Former partners, bitter women, people who misunderstood investments. Emily knows the truth about me. She trusts me." The words dripped with patience, but beneath them I could hear iron. He was controlling the narrative, even in my daughter's ear, even as she wept. I tried once more. "Emily, please just look at the evidence. Read the documents before you sign your life away to this man." Her sobbing filled the line, raw and broken. Then her voice sharp as glass. "Don't come to my wedding, Dad. I mean it. If you love me, stay away." The line went dead. I sat frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear long after the screen had gone black. The folders of evidence stared back at me, from the table-mute witnesses to a battle I was losing. My daughter's trust had been twisted into suspicion, my love recast as sabotage. Brandon had won, at least for now. The hours after blurred. I wandered through the apartment, touching the edges of familiar objects as though they might anchor me. Margaret's photo, the books she loved, Emily's graduation picture. Each artifact was a reminder of what I had once believed unbreakable family truth trust. Now all of it felt fragile, dangling by threads Brandon had already begun to sever. That night, I opened Margaret's journal again. The page felt heavier than paper, as though it carried judgment. My handwriting looked strange, like someone else's voice. February 14th, 2025. Told Emily the truth. She doesn't believe me. She said not to come to her wedding. I feel like I've lost her already. I closed the book and stared out of the window at the city. Valentine's Day below was alive with couples carrying roses, restaurants filling with candlelight laughter echoing from sidewalks. It felt like another world, unreachable. Mine was darker, colder, carved by betrayal. I thought of Margaret again. She would have pressed further, refused to let Emily dismiss her so easily. She would have shown up at Emily's apartment with the evidence in hand, forced her to look. I wondered if I should do the same. But I am not Margaret. I am a man worn down by years, dulled by grief, unsure if force would save my daughter or drive her even further away. So I sat in silence, listening to the radiator groan and the city hum, while somewhere in San Francisco, my daughter clung tighter to the very man determined to ruin her. The hardest part wasn't the rejection. It was knowing she believed my love was a threat, that my warning sounded like sabotage, that in her eyes, I had transformed from protector to obstacle. That realization hollowed me in ways I didn't know I could be hollowed. When I finally fell asleep, it was with the weight of a truth. I couldn't shake the man who had once held Emily's hand crossing streets, teaching her to ride a bike, drying her tears after schoolyard cruelties. He was no longer her hero. In her story now, I had become the villain. March 15th, the day fathers are supposed to carry in their hearts, like a jewel arrived for me like a stone in my throat. The plane touched down in San Francisco under a sky washed clean by rain, the air smelling faintly of salt and blossoms. I had convinced myself that showing up, even unwelcome, was better than abandoning the chance to witness my daughter's vows. I told myself I would stay quiet, sit in the back row if necessary, just to see her smile in her gown, just to hold on to the last thread connecting us. I carried the necklace in its silk-lined box like a fragile promise. It had cost more than any car I'd ever owned, but money wasn't the measure. It was meant to say what words could not, that no matter what had passed between us, no matter what walls she'd raised, I was still her father, still on her side. The Ritz-Carlton towered above me, a marble monument to luxury banners draped across its facade, bearing Emily and Brandon's names entwined in cursive. Guests streamed in laughter and perfume drifting through the revolving doors. For a moment, I almost believed I could step inside unnoticed, slip into the sea of silk and tuxedos like any other proud parent. But then, my eyes caught the gleam of an easel by the entrance. My own face stared back at me, magnified, framed in gilt. Beneath it, letters in black calligraphy declared, "Entry forbidden. David Miller, by request of the bride and groom." The air drained from my chest. My knees trembled as though the ground had tilted. People slowed, glancing between the poster and me, their eyes darting away when I noticed. Some whispered, others looked openly pitying. I could feel the heat of their judgment, the silent verdict of strangers who now knew I was the father, not welcome at his own daughter's wedding. The necklace box slipped in my sweaty grip. For a moment, I thought I would drop its scattered diamonds across the marble steps for anyone to trample. I bent down and set it carefully beneath the easel like an offering at an altar, the silk wrapping glowing faintly in the afternoon sun. It looked absurd, a symbol of love, rejected before it could be received. A security guard stepped forward. His uniform pressed his face, drawn into lines of discomfort. His name tag read, Martinez. He spoke softly, almost apologetically. "Sir, you're not on the list of guests. I've been instructed you cannot enter." I swallowed hard. My voice came out raw. "This is my daughter's wedding." He shifted his weight, avoiding my eyes. "I'm sorry." The couple gave very specific instructions. His hand hovered near my elbow, not forceful, but guiding the way one might move someone gently out of harm's way. Through the glass doors, I could see white roses arranged in cascades, crystal chandeliers casting light across linen-covered tables, a quartet tuning strings. My $60,000 lived in those details, the shimmer of silverware, the blooms on every table. All of it transformed into beauty. I was forbidden to see a kingdom built on my sacrifice, yet locked against me. Guests filed past. Some recognized me from Emily's childhood old neighbors, from Queen's colleagues from years ago. Their eyes flickered with recognition, then quickly away. Pity, shame, curiosity, they carried all of it past me like a current. I couldn't stop. For them, this was gossip to whisper over champagne. For me, it was the unraveling of a life's work. I straightened my tie, squared my shoulders, and nodded to Martinez. "Could you call me a cab?" Relief softened his features. He must have expected an outburst, a scene of father pounding on doors. But humiliation had hardened me differently. There were no theatrics left, only a quiet resolve colder than grief, sharper than rage. The cab arrived. As I slid into the back seat, I turned once more to the poster. My own eyes stared back at me from that smiling photograph, a man who had once believed family was unbreakable. That man was gone. Brandon had ensured it. The cab wound through the streets of San Francisco, past cable cars clattering uphill, tourists snapping photos, couples strolling hand in hand. The city was alive with celebration, while inside me, a silence had calcified. The driver asked where I wanted to go. Without hesitation, I gave the address of the Chase Bank downtown. I arrived 15 minutes before closing. The marble steps gleamed less ornate than the Ritz, but no less imposing. Inside, the air was cool, clinical, the hum of fluorescent lights replacing violins. I approached the teller's desk with deliberate calm, laying my ID on the counter. "I need to cancel a check," I said. The young banker's fingers tapped across her keyboard. "Check number 3114, amount $60,000. Payee Brandon Hughes." My voice did not waver. She hesitated. "Sir, if the check has already been submitted for payment, this could cause problems for the recipient." I met her eyes with a steadiness I didn't fully feel. "That's exactly what I intend." Understanding flickered across her face. Without another word, she pulled out the forms. I signed them slowly, carefully, the same signature I had written on the original check, but this time with grim satisfaction. "There's a $35 processing fee," she explained. "The stop payment is now active. Any attempt to cash or deposit will be declined." She slid the confirmation slip toward me. I folded it neatly, tucking it into my wallet beside a photo of Emily from her college graduation. Her eyes had been full of hope that day, her future bright and untainted by predators like Brandon. Now that photo sat pressed against the receipt that might ruin her wedding but save her from a lifetime of ruin. As I stepped back out into the golden light of the California evening, the irony struck me. At the Ritz, guests were raising glasses to a marriage built on lies. Musicians were warming strings, florists adjusting centerpieces, caterers preparing plates. But in a matter of hours, Brandon's empire of charm would collapse, not with shouts or violence, but with the cold efficiency of a bank system denying a check. Sometimes revenge doesn't need noise. Sometimes the sweetest justice is silence signed in ink, sealed with a confirmation number. I hailed another cab this time, not toward the Ritz, not toward humiliation, but back to my hotel. Behind me, the electronic systems of Chase Bank updated themselves, preparing to embarrass a con man in front of every guest, every vendor, and, most importantly, in front of my daughter. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. Back at the hotel, I sat in the armchair by the window, with the city sprawling out beneath me. San Francisco glowed with evening light, the bay rippling silver as ferries cut across the water. I should have felt sorrow at missing my daughter's wedding, but instead, a strange calm settled over me. I had pulled one stone from beneath Brandon's carefully balanced tower, and now I was waiting to hear the crash. At first, there was only silence. I poured myself a weak scotch from the minibar, turned on the lamp, and sat with the confirmation slip folded neatly in my wallet. I checked the clock. 6:30. By now, the ceremony would be complete. Emily walking down the aisle in a dress I would never see guests rising, violins soaring. She would have looked radiant, no doubt her smile lighting the room, believing in a future she could not yet see, was a mirage. And then, inevitably, the reception would begin the real test of Brandon's finances. It started with a text. My brother Frank, who had flown in from Boston, sent a photo of the ballroom tables gleaming under chandeliers. "Beautiful ceremony," he wrote. "Wish you could have been here." The words stung, but I read them twice, my eyes lingering on Emily's face in the blurred background, her cheeks flushed, her eyes glistening. My daughter was a bride. I felt the ache of pride even through rejection. Then another message pinged, this one from an unfamiliar number payment terminal acting up. Very strange. It was followed by another, "Harold looks like he's seen a ghost." They must have meant Brandon. I leaned forward, glass in hand, pulse quickening. The dominoes had begun to fall. I imagined the scene. Brandon striding confidently to the catering manager, slipping out his black American Express card with the flourish of a man who thrived on appearances. He'd already used that gesture once in front of me, a performance of wealth and control. The card would slide into the terminal, the machine would beep, and then the rejection, declined. At first he'd smile, wave it off, blame a technical issue. He'd hand them another card, perhaps two, each one carrying the weight of previous schemes, each one declined in turn. By now, the catering manager's polite smile would have tightened. "I'm sorry, sir. We need immediate payment before dinner can be served." Voices would rise. Guests would begin to notice. The string quartet might falter, glancing at each other as contracts went unpaid. The florist, seeing the unfolding storm, would quietly instruct assistants to begin removing centerpieces to protect their investment. The photographer, suddenly aware that his fee hung in the balance, might start packing up equipment, murmuring apologies to guests who could no longer pose for professional memories. And Emily, my daughter, standing in the middle of it, all her gown heavy on her shoulders, her eyes wide with confusion. "Brandon, what's happening?" she would ask, her voice breaking. But Brandon thrived on improvisation. I could hear his voice now rising above the murmurs. "Your father, he did this. He sabotaged us. He couldn't bear to see us happy." He would spit my name like a curse, turning suspicion back toward me, even as his empire crumbled. My phone buzzed again. This time a voicemail notification. I didn't listen immediately, savoring the silence before I let chaos enter. I poured another drink, the amber catching the city lights, and pressed play. The first message still carried confidence. Brandon's voice, steady, practiced. "Mr. Miller, there seems to be a technical issue with the bank. If you could please call back, we can straighten this out quickly." The next message, minutes later, was sharper. "Sir, I need you to contact your bank immediately. This is urgent." By the 15th message, the veneer was cracking. His voice rose, panic bleeding through. "Please, Mr. Miller, you don't understand. This wedding is falling apart. You have to call me back." I sat back in the chair, letting the desperation wash over me like a balm. This was the sound of justice not delivered by courts or police, but by silence and the cold machinery of a bank's refusal. As the night wore on, the messages grew more frantic. Vendors shouting in the background, guests murmuring, the hollow echo of a ballroom unraveling. Brandon begged, threatened, bargained. "You'll get your money back. Just help me this once." His voice broke into something raw, stripped of charm. By message 37, the panic was unmasked. "Please, sir, Emily is crying. Everything is ruined. I'll do anything. Just make one call." I closed my eyes, picturing my daughter in that ballroom mascara, streaking her dream, dissolving in real time. My heart clenched, but I forced myself to hold steady. Sometimes a father's duty is to let the truth reveal itself, even if it shatters the person you love. Then came the 73rd call. My phone buzzed again and again, the screen flashing with Brandon's number, until finally, between his attempts, Emily's photo appeared. My daughter's face, smiling in happier times now, a beacon of desperation. I didn't answer, not yet. I let the voicemail collect, and when it came, it was her voice. Fragile, broken. "Dad, please come back." Brandon confessed everything. The words hung in the air like a bell, tolling the end of something. I set down my drink, staring at the phone as her sobs filled the background. The satisfaction of revenge faltered, replaced by the ache of a father hearing his child finally break free of illusion. I knew then that my silence had done what warnings could not. The mask had fallen. Brandon had collapsed. The 73rd call was the one I finally answered. The screen glowed in the dim hotel room, Emily's contact photo trembling with the vibration. I pressed the phone to my ear and heard not the bright, confident woman who had announced her engagement weeks ago, but the little girl I once carried on my shoulders through Prospect Park, her voice small and trembling. "Dad," she whispered, words breaking like glass. "You were right. About everything." Behind her voice, I heard chaos, shouting footsteps, the dull murmur of guests leaving in clusters. And then Brandon, his tone sharp, desperate, pleading with her to stay, to listen, to forgive. He sounded like a man trying to stuff paper back into a fire once it had already caught. "What exactly did he tell you?" I asked, my own voice steadier than I expected. She inhaled shakily. "About the money, about his debts, about the other women." Her words caught on that last phrase as though saying it aloud turned betrayal into something solid, undeniable. I closed my eyes and gripped the phone tighter. For weeks I had carried the weight of suspicion, of evidence, of silence. Now it was real for her too. "Emily, I'll come back to San Francisco. But understand this, there will be no more checks, no more money. I can't save him, and I won't try." Through her muffled sobs, she whispered, "I don't want you to save him. I just need you." The line held our grief together, two voices stretched across miles of phone wires and years of love, trying to find one another again. I hung up and sat motionless for a long time. The city outside shimmered, the Bay Bridge lights tracing arcs through the night. Somewhere across town, the Fairmont's grand ballroom was collapsing into ruin, guests filing out with pity in their eyes, vendors hauling away flowers and half-served dinners. Brandon's mask had cracked in public, and the man beneath it was nothing but a desperate fraud. I booked the red-eye flight back to San Francisco without hesitation. The next morning, the air at SFO carried that peculiar mixture of exhaustion and new beginnings. Travelers shuffled with coffee cups, families herded children, businessmen barked into phones. I walked through it all with a single purpose: to find my daughter. She was waiting outside the baggage claim, her emerald dress, wrinkled mascara, smudged in lines down her cheeks. She looked less like a bride and more like a child lost in a crowd. When she saw me, she folded into my arms without a word, her sobs muffled against my chest. I held her tightly, feeling the fragility of her shoulders, the way heartbreak had hollowed her. When she finally pulled back, she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Dad." I shook my head. "No apologies. You believed in love. That's nothing to be ashamed of." She nodded weakly, and we walked in silence to the car. Over the following days, the truth spilled out of Brandon like coins from a split purse. Emily told me how he had confessed once the vendors demanded payment. The stories he had spun unraveled into contradictions. His portfolio was fabricated, his businesses registered to P.O. boxes, his so-called frozen assets nothing more than smoke. He admitted debts, failed ventures, lawsuits he had hidden. And when pressed, he broke down, begging Emily not to leave promising change, swearing love in the same breath he confessed betrayal. She told me how she had looked at him then not as the charming man who had swept her into a whirlwind engagement, but as a stranger who had stolen months of her life and nearly her future. She said it was like waking from a dream, the kind that dissolves the moment you open your eyes. I listened without interruption, letting her speak until her voice cracked, letting her cry when the shame overwhelmed her. Each word was another thread severed between them, another stitch tying her back to me. In the quiet moments between conversations, I thought about how close I had come to losing her forever. If not for the stop payment at Chase Bank, she might have married him, sunk deeper into his lies, lost not just money, but years. My silence on her wedding day, my refusal to intervene with force had allowed Brandon to reveal his true self in the only way Emily could believe, through collapse. And yet watching her crumble on my couch, curled beneath the same quilt she had dragged around as a child, I couldn't take joy in being right. Being right had cost her innocence, her trust, her dream of love. It had cost me the image of my daughter's wedding as a day of pride. 2 days later, I sat in the same chair by the hotel window, looking out at a city that had been the backdrop to my worst humiliation and, strangely, my redemption. Emily was asleep in the bedroom, finally finding rest after nights of sobbing. My phone buzzed with another notification, news of Brandon's meltdown spreading across social media. Guests had posted videos of the chaos, waiters refusing to serve, florists stripping flowers, the groom pacing red-faced, his mask gone. The internet had made my private war public. I closed the phone and stared at the skyline. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the sound of a ballroom going quiet, of a card machine beeping decline, of lies crumbling under their own weight. What mattered now wasn't that Brandon had been exposed. What mattered was that my daughter, battered but alive, had stepped back into my arms. 3 weeks later, the fog burned off early, and daylight felt honest again. The wedding was turning into rumor clips, captions, strangers deciding what it meant. Inside our small rental life grew quiet. Emily slept. I made coffee without listening for alarms. Folders I had carried across hotels waited like tools on a bench. I opened them on the table court, filings, screenshots, timelines, addresses that ended in mailbox numbers, and co-working suites, invoices from vendors who had not been paid the stop payment receipt from Chase. I called the investigator a caterer had mentioned and said I had more than notes. He said bring everything. 2 bureau agents met us in a windowless conference room that hummed like a refrigerator. They had the careful plainness of people who do grief for a living. They asked for sequence, not speeches. I told it in order: January's call, February's meeting, the check, the nights of search, the warning that sounded like betrayal, the poster at the Ritz, the Chase forms, the ballroom going quiet. I slid the bank confirmation across the table. An agent squared it with the folder's edge as if aligning a sight. They named the bones of the case: wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, identity theft. They asked about aliases. I handed over a page taped inside a folder: Brandon Hughes, Brandon Hart, B.R. Howell. They asked about entities. I listed LLCs with numbers and post office addresses. They asked about victims. Emily folded her hands to keep them from shaking and said there were others. By late afternoon, she had given a recorded statement. She spoke slowly like someone setting a fragile object on a high shelf. She did not cry until the elevator doors closed. The agents thanked us and left carrying our paper like a borrowed spine. The calls began a week later. A mother in Chicago, a sister in Seattle, a friend in Austin. They had permission to reach us and a need to breathe the same air as someone who understood. Their stories matched like fingerprints, whirlwind beginnings, perfect rings, urgent venues, assets, briefly frozen invoices that could not wait. We compared dates and saw overlaps. We compared emails and saw templates. Each voice made the case heavier and simpler. The indictment arrived on a Tuesday as a PDF that felt louder than it looked. Pages stacked with counts, transactions listed like footsteps. No chandeliers, no gowns, just the spine of numbers men like him hope no one reads. A press release followed, dry and exact, announcing an arrest warrant and inviting other victims to call. They took him 2 days later in a short-term rental south of the city, the kind of furnished quiet that poses as a life. The inventory list read like a resume for a person who didn't exist. 3 phones, 2 laptops, passports, and names. A mirror wouldn't answer to a row of suits in 1 obedient color business cards for companies with offices that were mail slots. Bail became arithmetic. The prosecutor treated flight as a plan, already in motion cash, withdrawals, encrypted messages, tickets unsent but drafted. A judge read the counts like weather and finally said the word that turns air to weight, remanded. Emily watched the mug shot on the evening news without flinching. The camera took inches and added years. Gone was the cultivated radiance. What remained was a face stripped of performance. She exhaled, then not triumph or relief, something quieter, like a muscle easing after too long, holding a door closed. Agents returned with forms that translate harm into process victim impact restitution forfeiture. They warned us to treat hope like a skittish animal. Money knows how to hide. They copied our bank statements and my journal page with the line I had hated writing. I gave him $60,000. The copier lamp crawled under the sentence. Shame felt briefly useful. Weeks stretched. The case widened. A grand jury listened to people who don't attend weddings but understand how they fail. An analyst laid out wire diagrams like transit maps. A technician explained IP addresses that had never seen San Francisco. A florist described lifting centerpieces while a bride tried not to shatter. The story we had lived became evidence that did not care about feelings, and that was a mercy. We went back to Brooklyn and learned small survival. Emily froze, her credit changed passwords, sold 2 designer pieces he'd pushed her to buy, sat with a therapist who could thread shame without tearing it. I made dinner badly, and then better. We walked the long loop in Prospect Park at dusk until our steps remembered ordinary time. On a park bench, she said she didn't trust her eyes. I said trust could be rebuilt, like a house slow and square and in daylight. When the indictment expanded conspiracy laundering aggravated identity theft, the agents warned our names might appear under footnotes. Headlines arrived and left like weather. Friends sent messages striped with outrage and comfort. We let most of them sit unread. One afternoon, an assistant U.S. attorney met us in a hallway and spoke a number softly, 15 to 20. Not a promise, not a threat, just a range of consequence. Justice, I understood, is not a knockdown. It is a corridor walked at a human pace, lit by fluorescent patience. That evening, the Bureau published a timeline. It looked like mine. The dates I had scribbled, the addresses I had circled there, they were typeset into a spine nobody could charm. Being right tasted nothing like victory. It tasted like finally swallowing water you've carried in your mouth for miles. The arrest did not return what had been taken. It did not unhang the poster or smooth the new crease between Emily's eyes, but it moved the story into a ledger that prefers truth, and that was enough for now. We washed 2 plates, set the kettle on. Outside, the city practiced its sirens. Inside, we practiced sleep at night. 3 months after the collapse, Brooklyn's sidewalks had traded winter's grit for the shimmer of early summer. Heat rose in waves off the pavement, kids shouted from hydrants, and the smell of grilled meat drifted from stoops where neighbors gathered in folding chairs. Life moved forward in its stubborn way, as if the world insisted on carrying on regardless of private wreckage. Emily arrived one afternoon with 2 suitcases scuffed by airports and sidewalks. Her shoulders were squared, her eyes ringed with fatigue, but steadier than they had been in weeks. She stood in my doorway, as if waiting for permission to step back into my life. I didn't wait. I pulled her into my arms, and she collapsed against me the way she had when she was 7, and the world felt too sharp. Inside the apartment was unchanged. Margaret's books still lined the shelves. Her photographs still smiled from the mantel. The leather chair still faced the window where I once sat staring at suspicion. But with Emily here, the air shifted. She carried the scent of airports, of loss of beginnings. She set her bags down and whispered, "Dad, forgive me." There was nothing to forgive. She had believed in love, and who could fault her for that? I told her as much. Her eyes filled not with the helpless tears of a bride abandoned at her own wedding, but with the quieter tears of a woman learning to forgive herself. We rebuilt in fragments. Morning walks through Prospect Park, her voice soft as she admitted how much he had taken her savings, her jewelry, even her sense of herself. Afternoons spent untangling accounts, calling banks, filling out forms that translated betrayal into numbers and codes. Evenings at the kitchen table where she helped me cook simple meals, and we ate in silence that was no longer heavy, but healing. She told me once over tea that the hardest part wasn't losing the money, or the ring, or even the wedding. It was realizing how easily she had given her trust. "I thought I was smarter than this," she said, staring into the cup. I told her trust was not weakness. It was the foundation of love, and sometimes the cruelest people are those who know exactly how to exploit that foundation. She nodded slowly, as though letting the words settle into a place she could hold. News of Brandon's trial spread. Headlines named his crimes, his aliases, his schemes across states. Victims stepped forward, and Emily's name was among them. She testified before a grand jury, her voice firm despite trembling hands. She spoke not just for herself, but for the others, the women who had been silenced or shamed. I sat behind her in the gallery, my chest heavy with pride and sorrow. She had found her strength again, piece by piece. At night, when the city hushed, I sat with Margaret's journal. The pages bore my handwriting notes of doubt, of fear, of mistakes. At first, they felt like failures carved in ink. But as I reread them, I realized they were markers of a path that had led us here, not unscathed, but together. Margaret had always said truth mattered more than comfort. The truth had cost us dearly, but it had also delivered us back to each other. The neighborhood watched us return to ordinary life. Mrs. Patterson downstairs waved more often, slipping baked goods into Emily's hands. The mailman nodded knowingly when he delivered stacks of official envelopes. Even the grocer across the street asked after her, his voice gentle. Community wrapped around us in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, as we walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, Emily slipped her hand into mine. She hadn't done that since she was a child. "Do you think I'll ever trust again?" she asked. I squeezed her hand. "Yes, not quickly, not carelessly, but you will, because you're stronger now, not weaker." She smiled faintly, a tired smile but real, and in that moment I believed it too. The healing was not cinematic. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic conclusions. It was in the small things, laughter returning at the sound of a silly joke, appetite returning with the smell of soup, sleep coming without nightmares. It was the two of us, father and daughter, learning how to exist again without the shadow of a fraud hanging over us. One afternoon, she unpacked the last of her suitcases. From its depths, she pulled out a small velvet box. The necklace I had left at the Ritz returned to her by a sympathetic vendor who found it during cleanup. She opened it, the diamonds catching light like stars. Her voice wavered as she said, "I wasn't ready for this then, but maybe I will be someday." I told her it had never been about wearing it. It was about knowing she was loved beyond measure. She closed the box and placed it gently on the shelf beside Margaret's photograph. The day Brandon's sentencing was announced, we sat together watching the news. 15 years with restitution, unlikely. His mugshot appeared once more, stripped of arrogance, a face emptied of the charm that had fooled so many. Emily turned off the television, after a moment, uninterested in watching him shrink into memory. "It's over," she said simply. I nodded. Not triumph, not vengeance, just closure. Now, when I sit in my chair by the window, the view feels different. The city still hums, but inside these walls, peace has begun to return. Emily is stronger, wiser, scarred, but unbroken, and I am no longer alone in the silence. Sometimes protecting the ones you love means enduring their anger, their mistrust, even their rejection. Sometimes it means being cast as the villain until the truth sets you free. But love is patient, and truth endures. In the end, justice came not with fanfare, but with the quiet resilience of a daughter who found her way back, and a father who never stopped waiting.